All right, friends. Yes, it is a large packet. Let's go ahead and start filling it out. So before we can get into Genesis, just one last place we have to stop, and that's talking about what we call the Torah or the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, or the 5 books of law, however you want to define it. We want to study Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as they were originally written, which is one whole telling one story. So it's what we call the Old Covenant. So this is the Old Covenant is being established in the books of the law. So what is the hope of the law? Here's your blank. The universal glory of the King of Kings who reigns through his Messiah. So this 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is pointing us forward to Christ. Okay? So Genesis, the first book of the law, sets the stage by clarifying 2 things. To clarify something means to make clear. What does Genesis clarify? First, the universal need for divine, here's your blank, blessing. Divine blessing. So Genesis makes it clear that all people need the blessing of God. Genesis also makes clear, here's your blank, the means by which God will restore his creation. So as we read through Genesis, we become very, very aware that we all need the blessing of God. None of us have the blessing of God. And Genesis shows us how we will receive the blessing of God. So what about Exodus through Deuteronomy? First, here's your blank. Detail the institution of the old Mosaic covenant. So Genesis through Deuteronomy, Exodus. Okay, are we writing? What? Detail the institution of the old covenant. So how did the old covenant come to be? Here's your blank. Clarify Israel's unique role in God's universal kingdom. So what is the purpose of the nation of Israel? What role do they have to play in God's kingdom? So another title for the law, we talk about the books of the law, is the Pentateuch. So the Greek word for penta meaning 5 and tukos meaning book. So when we talk about the Pentateuch, we're talking about 5 books. Caroline, you need to go to the restroom? You can go to the restroom if you need to. You okay? Okay. So we're talking about the 5 books of the law. Now, me just saying law can give you the wrong idea. Because as you have now read through the book of Genesis, it's not a bunch of laws. In fact, there are very few laws in the book of Genesis. It's got way more than just laws. It's got commands on how to, here's your blank, pursue justice. What does it look like for God's people and God's world to be active participants in bringing justice to the world? It got commands on how to live and act mercifully. What does it look like for God's people to be a people of mercy? And it's got commands on how to, here's your blank, live rightly in God's world. Now, these commands aren't just floating around out there. They're bound up within a narrative, a story. It's the story of how God made everything, sin broke everything, and how God is going to make everything right yet again. So this is a story that we're telling. So it's a narrative that teaches us about God and God's, here's your blank, purposes. God's purposes for and in human history. Madison?
I don't have 111.
111?
Yes.
Blessing. Divine blessing. So the law, this narrative that we read in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, details the initial stages of how God is going to build his kingdom. So when we're studying Genesis through Deuteronomy, it covers from the very beginning of time, which we're not going to get into how old the earth is. I got my theory, you may have your theory. It's not super important for this class. It covers from the beginning of time, Genesis 1:1, right? God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, to the death of Moses, which happened at about 1400 BC. So conservatively speaking, we're talking about 10,000 years. This covers about 10,000 years of history. It shows the fruits and failures of faith in the lives of Adam and Eve when they ate from the fruit, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, the nation of Israel. The most dominant human figure in the Pentateuch is, here's your blank, Moses. So we're going to meet Moses in Exodus chapter 3, and he's going to be with us to Deuteronomy 34 when he dies. So for most of the Torah, Moses is the one doing the speaking. He's the person we're interacting with. So in these 5 books, God does several things, 8 to be specific. 1, here's your blank, creates and judges his world. Second, He establishes, and here's your blank, renews covenants. Third, here's your blank, makes and fulfills promises. So God's creating, he's judging, he's establishing covenants, he's making promises, fulfilling promises. He rescues and commissions his people out of slavery in Egypt, commissions them to be his representatives in the world. He, here's your blank, dwells, D-W-E-L-L-S, dwells in the midst of his people and forgives their sin. We see God perform miracles like a 90-year-old woman getting pregnant, or water coming out of a rock, which I don't know how far you've gotten in science class with Miss Simmons. Usually that doesn't happen, right? That's kind of amazing that happens. These are miracles, a small taste of the miracles that God performs. In these 5 books, God, here's your blank, instructs. He instructs his own in the path of life. He tells his people, here's how my people are to live. Here's how my people show themselves to be different than the rest of the world. And 8th, and finally, he displays himself as both believable and his promises as, here's your blank, desirable. So my goal is simple. By the time you guys are done reading Genesis through Deuteronomy, which will happen probably by the end of this first semester, you'll have read the first 5 books of the law, which take a moment and I'm thinking about how amazing it is. Most adult Christians haven't done that, but you will. My goal is that by the time we get to the end of Deuteronomy, you'll know 2 things about God. 1, he can be trusted at all times. And 2, he is better than anything else. That's the purpose of the law, to show you God can be believed, God can be depended on, and God can be desired. Absolutely desired. And then number 5, the law was designed to highlight the establishment of the old, here's your blank, covenant. The old covenant. Now, I'm not your literature teacher, but I can give you a little sneak preview, a little hint for how to be good readers. If I write a 100-page novel, right, and one character shows up on every single page, like the same character keeps showing up, I'm telling you, this is really, really important. So as you read through these 5 books, you'll notice that like 80% of the space in this book is dedicated to the establishment and explanation of the covenant. And that should tell us something as readers. This is really important. Okay? The old covenant is really important. So do not, in your modern arrogance, think, oh, well, this is for people for 3,000 years ago. This doesn't apply to me. Skip, 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 skip. You are missing the point. This is massively important for you today. That's why it takes up so much room. So pay attention to the old covenant, how it gets established, what it's supposed to accomplish, how it gets broken, how it gets fixed. Pay attention to the old covenant. Gracie?
I'm sorry, I got behind number 428.
4:8 is desirable. Desirable. Yes. So as we talk about, as we talk about the old covenant, it provides us the lens for understanding the prophets and the writings. So later this year, Lord willing, when Sarah Adams is reading the book of Isaiah, which think about how cool it is that 7th graders are reading Isaiah. She's reading Isaiah. If she's been paying attention to the law, she'll understand what Isaiah is talking about, because Isaiah is accusing the people of Israel of breaking the law. So if we know the law, we'll understand Isaiah, we'll understand Jeremiah, we'll understand all those prophets that everyone's so confused by. You will understand more. There's still some pretty confusing parts. I'm at 5:2. The old covenant, here's your blank, anticipates. Anticipates, A-N-T-I-C-I-P-A-T-E-S, the need for the redeeming work of the Messiah, Jesus, right? The old covenant shows us, hey, here's God's standard, and Jacob Dover can't keep it, and Jacob Miller can't keep it, and people not named Jacob can't keep it. We could stack 2 Jacobs on top of each other. They still can't keep it, right? We can't do it. We need someone to keep the old covenant for us. And so the nature and purpose of this old covenant is viewed in light of the covenants that preceded it. First covenant that came before it is the Adam/Noahic covenant. This covenant that God made to say, I'm not going to destroy the earth. This is going to be a stage upon which I'm going to work out my plans of redemption. And the second covenant is, here's your blank, the Abrahamic. That's the word Abraham with an I-C. The Abrahamic covenant. What was the Abrahamic covenant? It's the covenant that God made with Abraham to say, I'm going to make your name great, and I'm going to bless you. And through your family, Abraham, I'm going to bless the whole world. So the old covenant is how God is working out those promises to defeat the serpent, to crush the head of the devil, and to bless the entire world through a people called Israel. Madison, you raise your hand?
I did not get 4:2 or 4:3.
4:2 is renews. 4:3 is makes. So the Old Covenant also anticipates the covenants that come after it. First off, here's your blank. The Davidic, that's the word David with an IC. John, pay attention and keep up. The Davidic covenant, this covenant that God made with King David, that someone from his line would rule forever. Because what becomes very clear is that no people, no person keeps the covenant. And what God's people need is a perfect king, and that's going to come through the line of David. So how does the law begin? Well, the law begins in Genesis 1, and the law begins by highlighting a couple of things. First, humanity's unique mission of, here's your blank, imaging, imaging, imaging God. Humanity alone has a unique purpose to display the image of God. John, read Genesis 1, 26 through 28.
And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all that moves, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
Thank you. So we alone have this image of God in us so that we can display the glory of God in the world. So the law begins by highlighting first our mission of imaging God. Second, the law begins by highlighting mankind's, here's your blank, failure. Mankind's failure to image God. Thomas, would you read Genesis 3, 6 through 7?
So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths.
And you guys know after reading the book of Genesis that this one sin in Genesis 3 is just the beginning of an avalanche of sin as mankind spirals down into chaos and rebellion against God. So we were made to image God. We have failed to image God. Caden?
What's
6:2? 6:2? Failure. So the third thing that the law highlights at the very beginning is the promise of a male descendant who would do two things. One, here's your blank, overcome the evil one. So right there in the garden, I always like to say like the juice from the fruit wasn't even dry on their chin, and God announces the plan to restore his creation. So the promise of a male descendant who would overcome the evil one, and two, here's your blank, reestablish universal peace under God's sovereignty. God made it, we broke it, but God is going to fix it. Genesis 3:15. Katie Lund, would you read Genesis 3:15 for us, please?
I'll put my enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. You shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise your heel.
So this is the gospel right there, that God's going to do something to destroy the works of the devil and the devil himself through an offspring of the woman. So that's at the beginning of the law. Our unique role is imaging God, our failure, and the promise of one who would overcome our failures. The law ends all the way in Deuteronomy 34 by highlighting two things. One, the unique role Moses played as mediator, right? Mediator is someone who stands between two people, as mediator of the old covenant, Deuteronomy 34:10. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So Moses was special. But the point of making Moses special, showing his specialness, is to point to another prophet who would come. So the foretold prophet like Moses that Deuteronomy promises will come suggests first, here's your blank, the temporary nature of the Mosaic covenant's administration, right? So the Mosaic covenant was intended to be temporary. The Mosaic covenant was like training wheels, which one day John will get taken off his bike. But for the rest of us, we had training wheels for a temporary period of time. And then once we could ride our bike, they were taken off. I just made fun of John and nobody even chuckled. What's the point? What am I even doing up here? If I can't make fun of John, what am I? Thank you, Jacob. I saw your smile. So the Mosaic covenant was intended to be temporary. And the foretold prophet like Moses suggests the long-term need for here's your blank, a new covenant. So Moses is important, but Moses is important because he's supposed to be temporary, and Moses shows us that we need something better. And that's going to be the new covenant, but we'll get there. Deuteronomy 18:15, God promises, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, Moses says, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. So I've got there that table in your notes, just a quick summary of the books that you're going to be reading. So Genesis, it's a prologue to God's universal kingdom, the need and provision for universal blessing. Exodus is King Yahweh and his global purpose through Israel, God's presence in Israel's salvation and mission. That's what you're reading right now. Next, we'll read Leviticus, Holy Yahweh and the necessity for holiness, pursuing God through his presence and promises. Numbers, faithful Yahweh and his unfaithful people, learning to wait and follow amidst seasons of discipline. How do we obey? How do we follow God even when times are hard? Sometimes because of our own actions. And in Deuteronomy, Israel's constitution. I call it a lasting covenant relationship and its end-time realization. Now, those are all a lot of big words. Don't worry. We'll explain those later. Now, I've got there that last point, the narrative structure of the law. So take a look at that. Genesis 1 through 11 is the primeval prologue. So Genesis 1 through 11 covers probably 10,000 years of history, but it does it in 11 chapters. So we're obviously going very, very quickly. That's the creation, the fall. That's the story of Cain and Abel. It's the story of the flood, the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 12, that gives us the beginning of the story of Abraham. Hold on one second, Madison. So that's the accounts of the patriarchs, 12 through 50, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus 1:1 through 12:30, that's Israel and Egypt. So that covers 400 years of slavery under the Pharaoh. But in Exodus 12:31 through 18:27, that's when Israel leaves Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai. So covered in that period is the Passover, and covered in that is the parting of the Red Sea, two pretty famous stories. From Exodus 19:1 to Numbers 10:10. So we're talking about more than half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and a third of Numbers. It's covering 1 year where they were camped at Mount Sinai. From Numbers 10:11 through 12:16, we start the journey and it goes wrong almost immediately. This is the famous story of the 12 spies being sent in the promised land and coming back and saying, we can't do it. For Numbers 13 through 19:22, it covers about 40 years. The entire generation that left Egypt dies. Numbers 21 through 21:35, we finally get to the plains of Moab. And from Numbers 22 through the entire book of Deuteronomy 34, we are on the banks of the River Jordan. Moses is giving his farewell speech, and we're about to go into the promised land. So we're going to cover all of that. That's kind of a roadmap of where we're going. Okay, Madison, you had a question?
What is a
Primeval would be like a prehistory. So we're talking about like very ancient history. And a prologue is that early part of a book, that first part of a book that kind of sets the conflict and here's what we need, and here's the hero, and here's the villain, and here's where we're going, and here's the hope. So that's the primeval prologue. Okay, yeah. All right, let's stop there for today.